Everyone, it's 2 o'clock, so I thought we'd get started. I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time out of your day today to attend the Emergency Watershed Protection Program webinar on the Limited Resource Area Initiative that is being provided by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law funds. That's part of the Justice 40 initiative as well. This is a great opportunity for those areas, and just wanted to go over some housekeeping, and that is the webinar is being recorded, and so it will be available for future access on our webpage, and we'll include a link to that in the Q&A announcements, and it will also be on our Watershed YouTube channel as well. Also, if you have any questions at any time throughout the webinar, feel free to just post it in the Q&A, which is accessible at the top of your screen. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll be able to address them then. So without further ado, I will introduce John Derbish, our National Emergency Watershed Program Manager, and I am ready for you, John, if you are.
All right. Well, thank you, Lark. Thank you so much for the introduction and the housekeeping. As Lark alluded to, my name is John Derbish. I'm the National EWP Program Manager, and I'm happy to share with everyone and thank you for coming to this exciting public information session and this exciting opportunity to utilize the EWP program to the best of our ability to help people who out there who are actually in need for this particular initiative. So I'm going to get right into it. Here we have we're going to go through kind of why we're here with this limited resource area initiative, kind of discuss an overview of the EWP process, and also talk about EWP buyouts. And what we mean there is sponsor held, local community held land acquisitions, and ultimately long-term land protection. So what we want to do here, as Lark alluded to, is we want to use recent appropriations and we want to prioritize Emergency Watershed Protection Program funding for limited resource areas. And we'll talk about what a limited resource area is in a second. And this prioritized funding for these LRA communities aligns with the agency's Justice 40 commitment to increase program participation across the board, and while assisting communities with climate resiliency. And we'll provide links on kind of that background as well at the end and in the write-ups. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to prioritize limited resource area communities through outreach and program flexibility. And that this webinar is just a component of that. So NRCS and local communities can pursue EWP property buyouts that are purchased and held by local project sponsors, which are state, local, or tribal governments or subdivisions of any kind of formal government, when they are the best option to reduce threats to life and property from a watershed impairment. And so NRCS is encouraging LRA communities to consider EWP buyouts to reduce threats to life and property from flooding. And I'm going to actually jump all the way to the end just to kind of help frame what we are actually trying to target here. And we're trying to target communities that are either have repetitive floods in the past, have flood threats in the future, and just need help for long-term protection. And when structural solutions or other avenues of relief aren't there, sometimes a property buyout is the last best option. And so NRCS is prioritizing some of our emergency watershed protection funding for these particular types of projects. So I just want to kind of give a visual and kind of, you know it when you see it, kind of approach to this. what are we doing? Well, we want to, NRCS EWP program has a definition called LRA areas, limited resource areas, and communities in those areas. And so those are, it's an economic factor that takes into consideration unemployment, housing prices, and per capita income and the like. And so those are the kind of starting factors for identifying LRA communities. LRA communities and count has been pre-calculated at the county level and the American Indian and Alaska Native area level. So where we could find the data, we kind of pre-ran and pre-calculated a lot of these, and you can find those counties and areas already listed on our particular website for this initiative. However, we can also, if the situation is more granular than a county level, and we need to determine LRA applicability at a smaller level, we can run those calculations on a case-by-case basis, and smaller areas than the county level unit may receive limited resource area designation based on localized unemployment, income levels, and land values. And that will be able to open this up to more areas than, like I said, just the county levels. And we can handle that, and there'll be contact information throughout this that says how do you actually enter this, who do you actually talk to in NRCS, how do you actually get into the program. And one of these things, we will work with you to kind of work on waivers of the LRA definition for areas smaller than the county. So putting this all together, there was a national announcement about the Biden-Harris administration investing in watershed infrastructures and prepare for natural disasters as part of the Investing in America agenda. And so that announcement had a link to this particular webinar. And so what we're saying here is that we're taking a what can be defined as a limited resource area in targeted approach to increase program participation, NRCS program participation. We are addressing flooding threats and instilling some climate resiliency where needed in particular communities. And we're going to do that through the EWP LRA buyout assistance, and hopefully provide as much as we can, as much as we have the authority to provide some relief to those in need. There is a public webpage that we'll have a link to in the kind of general materials for this, but this is where it kind of the public's first one-stop shop for getting the up-to-date information on this particular initiative, as well as there will be a state EWP program manager list at the bottom or in this page, and those people are up to date on this program and are the best source of information to be like, hey, I have the potential to meet the LRA designation, and we have some flood prone and flood threatened areas. We'd really like to further explore this EWP program. The state level EWP program manager is your best bet. So the EWP process. So the following slides, it's just a handful of slides. It's just a really quick primer on the EWP program. There's a more detailed overview that it's very dry and it's very straight to the point, but it's a 30-minute straight overview of the entirety of the EWP program. And so if anyone who wants to kind of get a larger feel for how this initiative fits into the larger NRCS EWP program, this particular 30-minute overview will be a great first stop, and it'll really provide you and any partner agencies or any potential sponsors with the information they need to kind of have an idea of what the program is about and how to work through it. So the EWP program, so it provides recovery assistance. So the program itself, this particular NRCS program, becomes available in two situations: either when a federal emergency is declared, or when a local watershed emergency occurs, and NRCS handles those internally. So There does not need to be, the point here is that there does not need to be a federal declaration in order for NRCS EWP assistance to be available. NRCS state conservationist, who's the lead decision maker in a particular state, has the authority to activate the program in more localized situations. So it's a very flexible program in that regard. And so what are kind of the early steps? And it's NRCS and local coordination, right? And it's working with emergency management agencies or cities, counties, tribal governments to identify EWP opportunities. And the main driver for the EWP program is provide protection for flooding and stop additional erosion, right? So everything that NRCS touches has to tie back to flooding and erosion threats. And this particular LRA buyout initiative directly addresses the flooding protection element. EWP measures, and then we're able to provide financial and technical assistance that removes the threats from the erosion and flooding and restore the natural environment. And we typically use NRCS conservation practices to carry out that mission. So getting into the EWP workflow, this applies to not only buyout situations, but it also applies to anyone who is interested in EWP program assistance from NRCS. So unfortunately, this is all too common occurrence. A natural disaster creates flooding and erosion threats, and that's the basis of the support that the program can provide. Then a sponsor, which is a city, county, tribal government, state government, can formally request EWP assistance. Normally, just a little caveat here, normally this has to be within 60 days from the disaster, but for this LRA initiative, in order to reach more people, we are going to waive that 60-day requirement for only these LRA buyout situations. So if a particular LRA community was flooded a year ago, 2 years ago, or it's just is in that landscape position that just keeps on getting threatened by flooding, we'll go ahead and allow them to request assistance for those previous disasters. Then what that sponsor request for assistance does is it compels NRCS action, and the NRCS state conservationist has to investigate the situation, check for EWP applicability, and complete what we call a damage survey report and cost estimate. So it's basically we put together a report to see, okay, what's is EWP eligible here, and what's the best course of alternative. And then if after that report is complete, if there are funds available in the national account, they're allocated to that particular project, and now funding has been allocated and dedicated to that project, and now it's a matter of getting to implementation and getting to acquisition and construction for whatever the proposed project is. So real quick, I alluded to this earlier, EWP sponsors, they can be EWP assistance in both technical assistance and technical financial assistance, as well as financial assistance can be provided to the recipients, what we call sponsors in the EWP program. Eligible sponsors include states, political subdivisions, qualified Indian tribes or tribal organization, local units of government, and basically the caveat is that all sponsors must have a legal interest in or responsibility for the areas threatened. So it's just, all decisions are keep it local. What's a sponsor's responsibility when they enter into the EWP program with NRCS? Well, they'll have to provide a share of project costs as determined by NRCS as either cash or in-kind services. And again, a caveat for this particular initiative, we're going to waive the cost share requirement for LRA communities who are pursuing floodplain buyouts. And so NRCS will be able to provide 100% of the cost share for these particular projects that we're presenting here today. They have to acquire the real property rights, water rights, regulatory permits. It's kind of anything local that needs to be done. If there's required O&M for certain structural things that may need to happen, or certain land treatment practices that need to happen. They'll be responsible for that going forward after construction. And they also have to document that they have insufficient funding to provide relief to the applicable threat. So EWP in context, this is kind of a very in the weeds slide, but it's just, hey, NRCS treats programs through a 9-step planning process, and we go through to kind of find and identify the best alternative. And in some situations that might be a providing financial assistance for local communities to purchase and conduct buyouts of properties. So we go through that, we go through a design requirements to make sure that what we're doing is technically sound, and then ultimately the properties are acquired and construction is completed, and that's kind of, you know, now the rubber meets the road, and there's groundbreaking as well. So how does this work? So this works through an NRCS and sponsor what we call a cooperative agreement. And it's a formal document that'll be signed by NRCS and will be signed by the community representative. It'll detail the responsibilities between NRCS and the sponsor. It'll document if and how funds are provided to the sponsors based on the sponsor's contribution to planning, design, and construction. So, and it's acquisition as well. So basically, it's an agreement about financial terms, but also an agreement for responsibilities. And we enter into that agreement, and then it's a partnership. And then from that point forward, you know, we work, NRCS and the partner work to actually implement the projects. And then one kind of caveat to EWP practices, another kind of very detailed slide, but it's everything EWP touches has to provide protection from flooding and soil erosion. Everything EWP does has to reduce threats to life and property. Everything EWP does has to restore the hydrologic capacity to the natural environment as much as possible. And then everything EWP touches has to be economically and environmentally defensible and technically sound. So, and then the other kind of fine print on this one is that NRCS won't provide funding for activities undertaken by a sponsor prior to the signing of the cooperative agreement. So there's not a mechanism for kind of reimbursing for prior work done. It's more, hey, we both have entered into the agreement, and now we will share in responsibility and costs going forward. So common EWP measures. A lot of people, when they think the EWP program, if you have any prior history with it, think in terms of maybe structural solutions. So the EWP program does a lot of stream bank stabilization, critical area planting, debris removal, mulching, grade stabilization, anything to kind of address the erosion threats that are caused after a natural disaster. But EWP also has other options, right? And it's and these are all agreed to by both NRCS and the project sponsor. You know, I always tell everyone it takes two to tango. So if the preferred alternative for both parties is a federally held floodplain easement, that's one route we can go, and we can pursue that, and that's a long-term land protection to kind of compensate landowners for the property while protecting property through more or less removing it and removing the threat to life and property. The other one here, and the one that we're discussing with the LRA initiative, is locally led property acquisitions, and we'll call buyouts, which is, like I said, where NRCS provides financial assistance to project sponsors to acquire land and ultimately put long-term land protection on it. So again, the cooperative agreement, the previous steps, how do we get here? Like I said, the sponsor for all EWP projects has to make a formal request. NRCS completes a damage survey report, and then funds are allocated within NRCS to that particular program. There's financial assistance, which is for acquisition costs, construction costs, and mitigation costs, but we also have technical assistance funds that's used for planning, design, contract administration, and construction inspection. So if the sponsor agrees to take on some of the planning, design, contract administration, inspection type work, then NRCS is able to also provide financial assistance for those activities as well. And both the parties enter into the formal agreement, which details the responsibilities and cost share. And again, it documents how funds are provided and who does what as far as planning, design, acquisition, and construction are going. All right, so EWP buyouts. So going back nearly 20 years now, back to the EWP environmental impact statement. So NRCS considers cost sharing with a sponsor, and this is just text from that particular environmental document, this NEPA document. But what we're saying here is that NRCS considers cost sharing with a sponsor to fund buyouts of residents in such flood-prone areas, flood-prone circumstances, because it would be the most cost-effective and environmentally preferable solution. You know, at the end of the day, we are the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and if the options are for the EWP program a very complex structural solution that ends up being very expensive and undesirable to the local community, versus, hey, there's the opportunity to conduct some buyouts that will allow either more to remove the threats from flooding and erosion, the properties being threatened by flooding and erosion, but also provide, you know, a more cost-effective solution. So cost sharing will be consistent with our program regulations, but for the LRA initiative, we will waive, and for LRA communities for the buyout initiative, we will waive the cost share requirement. And so NRCS will be providing 100% of the cost, acquisition costs in these particular projects. And then ultimately, still though, sponsors do have some responsibilities with in using NRCS financial assistance to purchase the fee title, get whatever easements need to be acquired or similar deed restrictions in this particular case. So that's long-term land protection will be determined by NRCS and the project sponsor, but typically a deed restriction might be the simplest mechanism for long-term land protection. So what we're doing here is, like I said, we're just presenting that, hey, when there's a natural disaster that has occurred and there is now flooding and erosion threats, what can the EWP program do? And the EWP program can install structural conservation practices, they can pursue federally held conservation easements, or we can also pursue locally held property acquisitions, what we call buyouts. So all these are at the table. It can be one, it can be a combination, it can be, you know, multiple. So whatever the best solution that NRCS and the sponsor can come up with is what we want to do. So EWP buyout interim guidance has been provided to the EWP state program managers. And so this guide is just sort of a general overview until we get it more formalized and into our e-directive system. But basically, it'll be used concurrently with the Emergency Watershed Protection Program Manual. We will be following EWP policy in order to implement this LRA initiative and provide LRA communities buyout opportunities. The requirements and the procedures presented in the guide that the that has been provided to NRCS, it'll be followed to ensue, hey, we've got the best opportunities for long-term success for these particular projects. So what are we, just formally again saying, what are we talking about when we say EWP buyouts? Well, specifically, EWP buyouts will provide financial assistance to local project sponsors for the purchase or relocation of an existing structure in the underlying land from a voluntary landowner when the property is threatened by additional flooding or erosion. Those existing on those properties, the existing structures are either demolished if it's most cost effective, or physically relocated to an area not being threatened by flooding or erosion if that's more desirable to the community and it's more of an environmentally and economically defensive solution. So long-term land protection, how are we going to accomplish that in these cases? Well, the sponsored acquired land is going to be deed restricted to remain in perpetuity open space and or may have NRCS conservation practices installed on it that restore the natural environment and provide protection from additional flooding and erosion. So what we're saying here is that the sponsor will be acquiring the property with NRCS financial assistance. The sponsor will then record a deed restriction to provide long-term land protection, and the result will be land that is some form of open green conservation space that has a public ownership in the end. And that public ownership will be the local community or local project sponsor. There will be some compatible uses kind of framed out in the deed restriction, but it also indicates that, hey, there might be situations where you'll need NRCS pre-approval to get kind of any kind of land use change that would occur, down the road with these particularly acquired EWP buyout areas. But things, you can think of the general, you can envision the general parks for outdoor recreation, wetland management, natural reserves, certain agricultural practices, and flooding and erosion prevention, rain gardens, the community things that are not going to be threatened that are not going to produce threats to life or significant property in the event of an additional flood or particular erosion event. The deed restriction will authorize NRCS to allow other uses, as I alluded to determine that, hey, what's compatible and what works and is compatible with open space and natural resource conservation. So eligibility will be based, again, on current EWP policy, but some other kind of tidbits to this will be, hey, we're going to be looking for voluntary sellers. This isn't necessarily it works best for everyone if voluntary sellers are involved. The deed restriction prior to execution will be approved by NRCS. The relocation structures are going to be taken out of the threatened area. The generic EWP program criteria will always remain. We need the EWP stands for watershed emergency, so we still need a watershed emergency. We still need what we call a watershed impairment. There needs to be some sort of a threat, and we have to, provide protection to a fixed and permanent property. Measure eligibility and program limits also apply. So there's some sideboards on the program that keep it focused on to get the desired effect for the program. And also back to defensibility, it has to be cost effective. And so currently FEMA has a pre-calculated benefits determination of $323,000 per acquired property. So that number, we can use that number ourselves, or we can also do other types of cost benefit analysis if a more localized assessment is needed as well. So just to reiterate, kind of putting the buyouts into the back and combining that with the EWP program. EWP program, the official kickoff is the formal request for assistance from a sponsor, and that's following a natural disaster, and it's saying, hey, we've been hit by something, unfortunately, and here's the areas we're looking at. Can you see if the EWP program applies? That compels NRCS to complete a damage survey report and cost estimate. If that checks out, then the funds are allocated to that particular EWP project, and now the state conservationist, NRCS, and the sponsor enter into a cooperative agreement that outlines who's responsible for what. And then ultimately, one of our taglines, help the people, help the land, put conservation on the ground. We're able to actually implement acquisition and construction projects that are hopefully providing some relief and recovery to local communities. So again, just some ideas about what the cooperative agreement would look like and kind of an outline on some of the milestones. These are just very generic, but if you're going through a property acquisition project, first things first, we ask that the sponsor put together lists of potential property owners, be like, hey, this is the flood impacted area. These are the properties that might be eligible, and go through some sort of either sign up or public meeting or any kind of outreach efforts to get to those communities and say, hey, we're pursuing emergency watershed protection program funding. Are you interested in this particular project at this time? And that list can be fluid, but you just got to start somewhere. Then we also look to have the sponsors do the contracting for the appraisals, title search, anything basically that a local community would need to acquire property. I like to say if the city knows how to acquire land for a library, then the city knows how to acquire land for this EWP buyout. But again, though, another milestone will be obtaining NRCS concurrence on the deed restriction. We just need to make sure that it aligns with the goals and intent of the program and the agency. Then the sponsor can go ahead and acquire the warranty deeds and the deed restrictions. And again, all of these steps have NRCS financial assistance provided to the sponsors for these projects. And then let's say the property is acquired and it's long-term protected. Now, the natural environment kind of restoration / floodplain restoration needs a little bit of that needs to occur. So we looked for designs on the demolition and construction plans, operation and maintenance plans, and quality assurance plans for the site restoration. Like, hey, how are we going now that we've bought these properties out and we put long-term land protections on it? Is there anything we want to do to kind of further the missions of NRCS? Then the sponsor can go ahead, solicit bids, award construction contracts, complete the demolition and restoration activities, and close out the project. So that's kind of a very high level view of what we would be looking at in a particular buyout project. Available cost share. So we've got two market valuation methods for property acquisitions. And this is, hey, if we're demolishing if the structure are to be demolished, then we can provide the real property cost of the land and the structures. If it's just relocation, we would just pay for the land. Very, very simple, straightforward stuff. But there's two ways to get the market value. One is at the time of sale, meaning, hey, basically we're talking about appraisals here. And so what's the time frame of the appraisal? The appraisal can be right now, like we do like any of us might be fortunate enough to do for a home purchase. Hey, go grab an appraisal. What's the value today? And that's what we're able to provide as compensation to the landowner for that particular property. There's also an alternative to look at, okay, well, what was the value of the property immediately prior to the most recent disaster or flood event? And then, so what was the value then? That one's a little bit more complex because now you have to also take into consideration applicable adjustments. If there was other federal programs that provided some relief, if there were unpaid insurance claims, or unused insurance money, things like that. So you just it's a little bit more math and a little bit more work, but both options are available for what is the actual market value of the land. So yeah, like I said, NRCS will provide funding for appraisals, provide funding for the cost of the title searches, title insurance, inspection, surveys, settlements. Like I said, anything that the local community needs to acquire the land. The other costs, things like lot clearing and any kind of conservation practices that restore the natural environment, we will be happy to provide financial assistance for that as well. And also, there's offsets to adverse impacts, right? So these emergency practices do have an adverse impact, and one of those is reducing housing availability, and so moving people is an adverse impact. So tenants are allotted relocation assistance, and there's other types of replacement costs that we can factor in to be like, oh, okay, the property was a comparable property that's not in the hazard area is actually more expensive. So based on those averages, we're able to also provide sponsor or landowners a little bit more than the purchased property, dependent if a replacement home is more outside of the flood or outside of the flood threat area. So it's all stuff that kind of we'll work out with the local communities and the project sponsors on a case-by-case basis. But we just want to make sure that we're doing the best we can to actually help these communities in need, and doing everything we can within our program's authority to do that. And then going forward, fast forward 5-10 years, post buyout, what's the environment look like? Well, one of the things that might come up is a transfer of property interest. Let's say a city, a county was the project sponsor and acquired the land, but now it makes more sense that the city owns that land, or some land trust wants to come along and string some conservation land together, and these properties happen to be adjacent. That works too. So the project sponsor may transfer a property interest only with the prior approval from the NRCS state conservationist, like I said, who's the lead decision maker in each NRCS administrative unit, and is only to certain entities. So the person that the land goes to basically has to be another qualified sponsor, aka another unit of state, local, or tribal government, or some sort of a qualified conservation organization. And there's minimal criteria for that, but it's basically, like I said, land trusts that are interested in stringing some properties together. So in conclusion, we're going to use existing EWP authority and processes to provide protection from flooding, to safeguard lives and properties in LRA communities, to increase program participation and climate resiliency. And just the last overview, and all EWP work, and it's same for this initiative, is going to be kicked off with a sponsor request for assistance. NRCS will take a look, check for EWP program eligibility, put together what we call a damage survey report and cost estimate, make some proposals, and then NRCS and the project sponsor will enter into a formal agreement, and that'll detail the responsibilities and cost shares that's available, and we'll document what we need to do to get and accomplish the milestones in order to get the desired end state. And in this case, it's to provide, like I said, relief to local communities, specifically LRA communities, where sometimes a buyout is just the best option, unfortunately. So again, just thinking in everyone's mind what these projects look like. We know it when we see it, and it's these particular areas that just get either repetitive floods, or something's changed, or something's going to come, and the site conditions have changed, and it's just like, hey, we need to do what we can to try to move some of these people out of the harm's way here, and the EWP buyout alternative is one option for these kind of particular settings. Other ones, it can be even, it can be anything from urban to suburban to rural type opportunities, when, like I said, when it's environmentally defensible, when it's economically defensible, and sometimes we just got to either move property out of the way, or purchase and demolish the property as well, and provide people kind of a fresh start. We're here to do that as well. EWP resources that we'll provide in the links to this at the end and in the follow-up. Like I said, there's a 30-minute overview of the project, of the program, and that'll kind of get the nitty-gritty details on it. We have a web page that's generic to EWP, but then also you'll be able to find front and center links to the LRA initiative. And also, again, though, when you're ready to talk to someone, the EWP state program manager is the best bet, because they will be well versed on this particular subject. And they'll be able to get you on the right path to hopefully providing some sort of assistance. So with that, Lark, I don't know if you want to take it back and see if there's any questions, or what the next course of action you want to do is.
John, I think we're good. I think there doesn't appear to be any questions, and so it was well presented. I think everyone's got the gist. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, thank you for hosting, and thank you for arranging this, and we look forward to hopefully getting some quality projects, like I said, because this is a good opportunity and a great opportunity for us to help some areas that we haven't been helping with with EWP, and we want to do the best we can. So thank you, Lark.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Thanks so much again for attending, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And again, I'll follow up. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lark.